Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Circadian Rhythms in Bipolar Disorder. I'd like to remind you all that if there's time at the end, we will be answering some questions. So if you're attending through Zoom, please ask any question in the chat box or the question and answer portion. And if you're joining us on Facebook Live, you can just leave a comment. Our presenter today is Dr. Michael McCarthy. Dr. Michael McCarthy is a staff psychiatrist in the Mood Disorders Clinic at the VA San Diego Medical Center and associate professor of psychiatry at the UC San Diego College of Medicine. He earned a Bachelor of Science in Biochemistry and Psychology from the University of New Mexico before completing his doctoral training in Medicine and Neuroscience at Ohio State University. Dr. McCarthy developed an interest in bipolar disorder during his residency training at UCSD from 2005 to 2009, and subsequently completed a 2-year postdoctoral research fellowship in psychiatry or psychiatric genetics and chronobiology. Dr. McCarthy joined the UCSD faculty in 2011. Presently, he runs a research group focused on the cellular, genetic, and molecular mechanisms that cause bipolar disorder and/or determine clinical response to medication treatments, and is the principal investigator on a variety of funded basic and clinical research projects in bipolar disorder. Dr. McCarthy continues to teach, supervise clinical and research trainees, and treats patients weekly. He serves on the editorial boards for 3 international journals, the executive committee of the Center for Circadian Biology, is a member of the International Society for Bipolar Disorders, and an associate member of the American College of Neuropsychopharmacology. Thank you so much for joining us today and presenting your research.
Great. Well, thank you for that kind introduction and welcome everybody. It's really an honor to be here today, and thanks to the International Bipolar Foundation for inviting me and making this possible. It's really exciting. As you heard, the name of my talk today is Circadian Rhythms in Bipolar Disorder. And let me see if my slides are advancing. There we go. So just to give you a quick overview of what I'll be talking about, I'll just cover briefly what are circadian clocks, and I'll include why do we need them, how do they form, and how might they be different among different individuals. Then I'll transition into a little bit about how circadian clocks go wrong in bipolar disorder, and we'll talk about sleep, activity, mood, and then some of the genetic and cellular reasons that might be happening. And then to close at the end, we'll talk a little bit about maintaining healthy rhythms. So, as you all know, we live on a world that has a 24-hour light-dark cycle. This is caused by the rotation of the Earth on its axis. And this has done some really profound things over the course of history to the environment. So it causes this predictable change in light and dark. And this makes evolutionary pressures that cause life on Earth to respond to that in a very profound and important way. And there are examples of this that extend on seasonal cycles, such as hibernation, or monthly cycles, such as the menstrual cycle, hourly cycles, such as REM sleep, which happens on about a 90-minute cycle, or circadian rhythms, which is what we'll be talking about most of this morning, which is cycles that happen over a 24-hour period. And I thought I'd just start with circadian rhythms in the most basic way, because I think sometimes it's easier to understand these in terms of other forms of life. Why do we need these? So think for a plant for a moment. Plants photosynthesize. They require sunlight to grow, and then they rely on insects to pollinate them, but insects might also harm them or eat them. They are very sensitive to water and heat. And so plants have adjusted these systems to adjust over the course of the day to respond to light and dark. And then some single-celled organisms, like photosynthetic organisms, or organisms that need to divide in order to survive on a regular basis, they don't want to be dividing during peak times of sunlight when their UV rays are going to damage their DNA and cause problems in reproduction. So these kind of simple organisms, in a very obvious way, have these circadian rhythms that let them adjust to these negative consequences of light or dark. And in this way, I like to think of the circadian clock kind of like a specialized arm of the stress response. So we think of the stress response as fight or flight, but fight, flight, or adjust might be a better way to think about it, where you can anticipate the stress and change your physiology accordingly. So humans have circadian rhythms as well too. We're not any different in this regard from animals or single-celled organisms. So we have these times during the night where we tend to have sleep, we have less socialization, our bodies go into a storage phase and a repair damage phase. Whereas during the daytime, we then go into a state of alertness where we are more likely to socialize, we burn calories, we're active, we take physical damage from being up and around and are exposed to heat. And so our physiology has these changes in circadian rhythms as well too, that affect things like energy and attention, our temperature, our blood pressure, a lot of our digestive functions and metabolic functions. Pretty much any physiological system that you find in a human has some indication that there's a circadian rhythm involved in that. I'm sorry, I think my computer is running a little slow. Let's see, there we go. And so one of the things that's interesting about circadian rhythms is these things persist even in the absence of any external cues. And so that's what really makes them special, is these are intrinsic clocks that are ticking even when we're locked up or unable to see what time of the day it is. So these are some experiments that were done in the 70s and 80s. This first one on the left is a lady named Stefania Follini, who was set up in a laboratory in Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico for 4 months in isolation. And despite having no contact with the outside world for this entire time, she managed to maintain a 28-hour cycle on her sleep-wake cycle. And there's really no reason that it should fall into that sort of pattern, like a roughly 24-hour cycle, unless there was something intrinsic in her biology that was driving that. And this is another example of a patient or a subject who spent 10 days in isolation without a clock. And the first couple days, he had the clock. And after the clock stopped, you can see that his activity pattern still maintained, that's indicated by these black lines, still followed about a 27-hour cycle. So it's not exactly 24 hours. So sunlight certainly is having some effect on our ability to keep track of time, but it's not random, and it's something that's about a day long. And so the first thing that people think about when they think of circadian rhythms in humans are sleep. And the circadian clock is certainly involved in sleep, but it's not the only thing involved in sleep. So I'm going to take a brief detour here to talk a little bit about the physiology of sleep. So you can think of the circadian clock as a mechanical clock that keeps on ticking regardless of the circumstances. Whereas we have another timekeeping system in our bodies that helps with sleep called the sleep homeostat. And this is more like an egg timer that resets when we sleep. So the sleep homeostat gradually builds up what we call sleep pressure over the course of the day. And the longer that we're awake, the more this pressure builds. And this tends to increase our propensity for sleep. Whereas the circadian clock is kind of ticking along on its pattern regardless of when the last time we slept was. And what that creates is this system where you have these two factors that are usually collaborating with each other. Usually as you wake up in the morning, your likelihood of staying awake gradually decreases over the course of the day until you start to sleep. And then with rest, your sleep pressure gradually resolves and you gets down to zero and you wake up again the next morning. At the same time as the sleep pressure is increasing, you have this alerting signal that's keeping you awake during the course of the day. And these things tend to balance out most of the time. This gray part here is your likelihood of being awake. So your circadian system dominates early in the day when it's early. They kind of reach this equilibrium through the afternoon. There's a little dip here where the sleep pressure starts to catch up. This is kind of the siesta period. And then in the evening, there's alertness again until the time of sleep. So when the circadian system and the sleep drive system are working together, there's this nice synergy here where the two things are working towards each other and cooperating with each other. But you can imagine a situation where maybe you took a nap in the middle of the day or you worked a night shift, and these two things then become out of sync with each other, and then you can start to have problems where the sleep system and the circadian system are working against each other. The other thing that's circadian that I like to think about a lot as a psychiatrist is maybe surprising to people, and that's that moods tend to be rhythmic in people as well too. And this has been shown in a variety of different ways. The one that I think is kind of fun is they've proven this on Twitter. Some scientists back in 2011 harvested 2.4 Twitter messages and did some fancy computer programming to analyze the content of the messages. And they actually found that there was rhythms in the positive and negative content of these Twitter messages that seemed to oscillate over the course of the day. So you can see here kind of in the early morning that the positive content of the Twitter messages is the highest, and it gradually goes down over the course of the evening and then back up again into the later hours of the night. And there's sort of this opposite phase with the negative messages. And this has been studied in a more kind of careful way with laboratory subjects who are brought into the sleep lab and kept on a 30-hour constant routine, which means that they have no access to light or dark information, and they're just periodically asked for their mood scores and asked for how they're feeling about their mood over the course of the day. And you can see that this change in mood has this kind of nice rhythmic pattern to it as well too. That lines up actually pretty nicely with the Twitter messages. So the positive affect seems to be peaking here in the middle morning, very similarly to what we saw here on Twitter. And so how are these rhythms created in the brain? It turns out that there's a part of the hypothalamus in the brain that we call the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or that's a very long word, so we sometimes call that the SCN. And this SCN is plugged in directly to the visual system. So the light information comes in from the eyes. And if you've ever taken a biology class or a visual physiology class, you know that this light information most of it goes back to the visual cortex here at the back of the brain. But one little branch of this light information stops before that and comes into the SCN and is involved in giving light information directly to the brain and tells it basically what time it is so that the rhythm can start every morning at the right time. And this is a photoreceptor system that's a little bit different from the rods and cones that you've probably heard of before. And it doesn't really convey anything about vision. It just tells about whether it's light or dark outside. And we usually think of rhythms in terms of these sine waves. So we think of the period as the time between peaks in a rhythm. We think of the amplitude as the intensity of the rhythm or how strong it is. And then the phase is the start of the rhythm. And so this SCN system that gets light information is really important for determining the phase. This, the start of this rhythm, where the arrow would be where the light information is coming on. And this is why you're able to change rhythms when you travel for a long distance. Say if you flew from San Diego to Europe, you would have jet lag for the first few days, but as your light information gets updated through your SCN, you would be able to reset your clock to the new phase, and the rhythm would pick up based on the local light conditions. And we also know now a lot about the genetics of the circadian clock, and a lot of this was done in animal studies. This is some work that was done back in the 90s looking at mutant mice, and mice have circadian clocks as well too, except theirs are a little bit different than ours in terms of they're nocturnal animals, so they tend to be active at night and sleep during the day. And this is an experiment showing just what a normal mouse looks like. This is a 48-hour time period here with 12 hours of lights on and 12 hours with lights off. And these black bars indicate wheel running activity from the mouse. So you can see that when the lights go off, the mice get really, really active. When the lights come on, they go back to sleep again. And when the lights come off again, they become active. And this goes on for several days until at this red line, they turn off the lights. And now it's just constant darkness. And you can see that this activity pattern in a normal mouse more or less continues. It's the timing of it shifts a little bit. It gets a little bit shorter than 24 hours, which is why you're seeing this move to the left. But the mice do a pretty good job of maintaining a rhythm even when the lights go off. In a different mouse with a mutation to a gene called clock, you see that the situation is very, very different. With the lights on, the mouse does just fine. And when the lights go off, the mouse is active. And when the lights come on, it goes to sleep. But when the lights go to complete darkness, the mouse's ability to maintain a rhythm in constant darkness is completely lost, and its movements become entirely random. So it shows that this clock gene is critically important for maintaining rhythms in these mice. And I'll fast forward through about 30 years of molecular biology and show you that the entire system of the circadian clock at the genetic level has now been figured out. So the clock gene that I just told you about binds up with this partner called BMAL. it binds to parts of the DNA that we call E-boxes, and it produces these genes called purrs and cries. And these purrs and cries gradually accumulate over the course of the day, kind of like the hourglass that I was telling you about before. And at a certain point, they come back into the cell nucleus, and they actually inhibit their own expression. So they sort of, it's organized in a negative feedback loop, where after the purrs and cries hit a certain level of activity, they go and they turn themselves off. And then because they're turned off, the purr and the cry in the cytoplasm of the cell gradually breaks down and goes away, and then the cycle starts back up again. So it has this nice on-off oscillation pattern that happens over about a 24-hour period, and it happens basically in every cell in the body. And because we've worked out the molecular biology of this, we've been able to do some really cool things where we hook on what we call reporter genes onto these clock genes, and we can study circadian rhythms in different parts of the body or in different kinds of systems. And so this is some experimental data that I borrowed from a colleague of mine named David Welsh, showing clock gene expression in the SCN, in the part of the brain that's the master clock, over the course of a 24-hour cycle. And you can see this is lighting up at the beginning of the cycle, it gradually becomes dim, and then over the course of the day comes light again. And you can see that by using these reporter genes, we can actually measure circadian rhythms in cells. And the reporter genes are actually made from the firefly enzyme called luciferase, which just glows in the dark. So you can hook this luciferase onto a part of a clock gene that gives it the rhythm, and then you can measure these light emissions flashing on and off with a 24-hour rhythm. And so moving into humans now, because the circadian clock is encoded in the genes, we can expect that there are individual differences in human genes that encode for circadian rhythms, and that turns out to be exactly what we see. And we talk about this sometimes in terms of chronotype. So your chronotype is your preferred time of day for your peak activities. And so we sometimes talk about this in terms of morningness or eveningness, so like, or how morning are you, or how evening are you, or whether you're a lark or an owl, an early bird or a night owl. And this tends to distribute like a lot of things in nature, kind of on a bell curve distribution. So most people tend to be somewhere in the middle, but we do have cases that are really out at the extreme. Some people are very, very strong morning people, and some people are very, very strong evening people. And it turns out in humans, this is about 40 or 50% genetic. There is some environmental impact, and there's some developmental impact as well too. Chronotype tends to change over the course of our lives. So anyone who has young children know that they are up very, very early in the morning. But then anyone who has teenagers know that they tend to sleep later and later into the morning, sometimes into the early afternoon. But then it comes back down again into older adulthood. And it turns out that on top of this developmental pattern, people are relatively stable. So if you're relatively an early bird as a teenager, you're likely to stay a relative early bird or a lark as an adult, even with this developmental pattern that's happening on top of that. So I'll talk quickly about the extremes of the chronotypes. We actually have circadian sleep syndromes that we talk about in psychiatry and medicine. And so the first one I'll talk about is advanced sleep phase syndrome. And so these are people who have normal sleep duration. They typically sleep about 7 or 8 hours a night. It tends to be relatively rare, only about 1% of adults. But they need to wake up very, very early in the morning, and they find it very, very hard to stay up late. So they might wake up at 4 or 5 in the morning, sometimes 3 in the morning, and then have a really hard time staying up past 7 or 8 o'clock at night. And these are people who often have social problems. Their partners or their friends worry that they can never socialize with them. They can't really do anything with them at home in the evenings. And it's because, the occupational impairment doesn't tend to be all that important, because nobody ever got fired for coming to work too early. It does seem that we have some genetic cases of this where it's been found in families where they've gone carefully through the family tree, and they've identified some of the genes that cause advanced sleep phase syndrome in some cases. And if people wanted to reverse this pattern, they may be able to expose themselves to light at night, which maybe shifts their pattern to be a little bit later in their bedtime and their wake time. The opposite of that is delayed sleep phase syndrome. And again, these are people who sleep a normal amount of time, but find it very, very difficult to wake up early. And they are profound night owls. They really, really like staying up late. And this one is a lot more common. It's thought to affect perhaps up to 7% of teenagers. And the genetics of this are maybe more complicated, involving many, many genes, although there has been a single gene that was recently involved in 2017 that was identified. And in terms of impairment, this one is sort of the flip side. These are the people who have a very hard time coming into work at 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning. If they have a college class that starts at 8 o'clock, they might have a really hard time being on time for that. But then they have the life of the party on weekends, and they often have an easy time staying out late and having fun in the evenings. And so the treatments for this would be sort of the opposite, where maybe bright light in the morning can sometimes help advance somebody's rhythm, or evening light restriction. So turning off the lights at home or using blue light filters, these are the kinds of things that may help, or even taking a melatonin to help promote sleep earlier on. And interestingly, DSPS seems to be associated with mental health disorders, but also with increased creativity. So there are sort of pros and cons to being a night owl that we'll talk about a little bit more in the context of bipolar disorder. Recently, there's been some really interesting studies that have looked at the genetics of chronotype in very big samples. So the biotech company 23andMe joined up with a big study in England with the UK Biobank, and they put together 700,000 people and have now identified about 350 genes that seem to be significantly linked with whether you're a morning person or an evening person. And I won't go into this in any kind of detail, but this is just what the data look like. This is this is the chromosomes of the genome over here, and each one of these black dots is a part on the genome that seems to have a statistical link to being a morning person, and then anything that's above this black line is statistically significant. So we sometimes call these Manhattan plots because these look like the skyline of a big city like Manhattan. And each one of these black dots is a little success story for science right there. So this is really cool. And it's taught us a lot about how the circadian clock is organized in people. It's taught us about what brain regions might be most important, and also how circadian rhythms may overlap with some other traits, including mental illness. So I'll show this in just a moment. But it turns out that there's links of being a morning person is actually protective for mental health and has less risk for depression. And so the other thing that it's taught us is, as people have studied this, is that it seems like circadian rhythm genes are present in just about every part of the body. Almost half the genome is rhythmic somewhere in one part of the body or another. And it turns out that at least half of our best-selling drugs in the United States target one of these proteins that's involved in circadian rhythms as well too. And so this means that circadian rhythms may have really profound links to a variety of health conditions. And I think at this point, the evidence is really strong, particularly for mood disorders, cognitive disorders, and dementia, and then things like obesity and metabolic diseases like diabetes. And so what could possibly go wrong if we have this great biological system? Well, our environment now is actually set up to be very difficult for the circadian clock. We expose ourselves to a lot of light at night, which I told you before was kind of a phase shifting signal. We eat at night, and so our SCN can respond to other signals in things like food and nutrition and activity. We do shift work, so we sleep during the day and we work all night in hospitals or airports or police offices or these sorts of things. We work in buildings that have maybe dim light or no windows, so we don't get the sunlight that we need to entrain our rhythms. We do long distance travel and jet lag. There's something called social jet lag, and this is where your internal chronotype doesn't match up well with your social environment. So for somebody with delayed sleep phase syndrome, if they have a hard time getting to work at 8 o'clock in the morning and they're still doing it every day, it's as though they're having to commute to the East Coast from the West Coast every single time that they go to work. And that has some physiological consequences as well too. Some medications may affect the clock. Seasonal changes, we're coming up on fall soon, so the days will be getting shorter. And then things like daylight savings time superimposed on these seasonal changes can be really rough on people's circadian clocks as well too. And each one of these factors may contribute to poor health outcomes. And so with that overview of the circadian clock in general, I'm going to get more specific now about bipolar disorder. So I'm sure for this audience, many of you already know this information, but bipolar disorder is a relatively common psychiatric disorder. It affects anywhere from 1% to 5% of the population, depending on exactly where you cut off the criteria. It typically affects young adults at first onset, anywhere between 18 to 30, with an average of about 25 years old. And it seems to be strongly genetic. So we know from looking at twins, where one subject has bipolar disorder and we want to ask, does the other one have that it's about 70 to 80% genetic overlap, or maybe 10% in a first degree relative. So if you have a parent or a sibling with bipolar disorder, your chances of getting bipolar disorder are roughly about 10%. So around 10 times higher than they would be in the population. And whether we know a lot about the biology and the genetics of bipolar disorder, but we don't exactly know what's causing the disease. But if we look at the symptoms of bipolar disorder, we can see that circadian rhythm disruption is really important. We see that mood changes over the course of the day are important. There are changes in light and mood. Sleep disturbances are a big thing, both during the depressive phase and the manic phase. Activity changes are a big part during mania, with increases or decreases during depression. There are changes in appetite, which is normally very rhythmic. Normally you don't get hungry in the middle of the day, normally you get hungry in the middle of the day and you don't wake up at night to eat, but that can sometimes become disrupted with depression. There are a lot of endocrine rhythms with melatonin and cortisol that seem to be shifted. And even suicide, one of the most tragic consequences of bipolar disorder, seems to have a circadian rhythm to it, where people who are about to attempt suicide are far more likely to do this in the late evening or early morning hours than they would be at other times during the day. People have looked at this in particular with relation to sleep. So disrupted sleep is a defining feature of both depression and mania. And even in between episodes, when people are feeling what we call euthymic, or their moods are normal, there still tend to be a lot of subjective sleep complaints in bipolar disorder. So people with bipolar disorder take a longer time to fall asleep. They have less efficient sleep, which means they might have more time waking in the middle of the night, and more overall time spent in bed and less overall time being up and active. And it turns out that these disruptions in sleep, or major disruptions in sleep, are often the first thing to go wrong when a mood episode is about to reoccur. So we see this as a predictor both for manic episodes and depressive relapses. This is some really interesting work that's been done using actigraphy. So actigraphy you might think of something like a Fitbit that tracks when you're awake and when you're up and walking around. And some of these studies that have done actigraphy have found really interesting patterns in patients with bipolar disorder. So this is a typical day for a control patient. These black bars indicate being up and moving around. This blue indicates the time that they're asleep. They go to sleep around maybe 9:30 and they're waking up around 6 here with the onset of sunlight. And then this black activity picks up again. And now compare this to the bipolar patient. You can see that there's a lot less black activity during the afternoons. You can see that the start times for sleep are a lot more erratic. It's quite late this time and a little earlier this time. The wake times are more erratic. This one's a little bit early, this one's a little bit late. And then the overall sunlight, which is in yellow, is actually decreased as well too. So not only is it less activity, but less exposure to sunlight. And so you can see that there's these disrupted activity patterns in bipolar disorder. And this actually translates into real world consequences. So the study by Jones in 2005 found that the patients with bipolar disorder are likely to have their first social contact later in the day, their meal times are adjusted, they're more likely to take a nap, and less likely to go outside and get that sunlight that's really important for stabilizing your rhythms. I told you about the genes for chronotype and genes for morningness. Well, it turns out that if you measure these genes carefully in patients with bipolar disorder, that the more genes you have for morningness, or being a morning type person, decreases your risk for both bipolar 1 and bipolar 2. So it actually seems like there's some genetic overlap here between circadian rhythm genes and bipolar genes. And this has been taken to animal models. I told you already about the clock mutant mouse. It turns out that the same clock mutant mouse has a lot of symptoms of bipolar disorder. So not only does it have disrupted circadian rhythms, but it has hyperactivity, it has sleep problems, it has what we call in science hyperhedonia, which means sort of a greater drive for stimulating or pleasurable activities. So things like drinking alcohol or taking drugs. It has more impulsiveness and reduced anxiety. And interestingly, in this animal model, a lot of these symptoms are changed when you give the mouse lithium, just like with people with bipolar disorder. And so I'm going to tell you now about some of the work that I've been doing in my laboratory. I showed you before about the reporter genes that we use in mice. We've been doing the same kind of thing using human cells. So we get a skin cell biopsy from a patient, and we grow up these cells in the laboratory. We use an engineered virus to put in one of these reporter genes that we call Per2-LUC. We put this into the genome of the cells, and then that lets us measure light emissions coming off the cells over the course of several days, because the cells literally glow in the dark. You can see this is a picture of the same plate of cells 12 hours apart. It's pretty dark here, it becomes a little bit lighter here. And when you measure that light emission very, very carefully, you can actually see a circadian rhythm in the gene expression coming off of the cells. And what we've done in looking first in skin cells from patients with bipolar disorder versus controls is we found that on average, the circadian rhythm is a little bit slower in the bipolar cells, which means that the period is a little bit longer. So in the control patient, in the control cells, the period was about 25 hours. And in the bipolar cells, it was just a little bit longer, about 45 minutes longer, at 25 and a half hours. And that doesn't sound like a big difference, but it turned out to be statistically significant. And you can see that maybe more clearly in this plot showing the individual data, that there are plenty of bipolar patients with rhythms in this sort of 25-hour period, but there are a lot more in this later 26 and 27 hours compared to the controls. In other experiments, we put lithium on these cells, and we found that the lithium actually has really important effects on the circadian clock. So a typical circadian rhythm is shown here in black. These are done in mouse cells, but the experiment with human cells shows a very similar kind of finding. And when you put lithium on the cells, you see that there's this boost in the amplitude. So the rhythm actually gets stronger, and the period gets a little bit longer. It goes from being, in this experiment, a little bit more than 24 hours to just about 25 hours. So we found that the lithium that we use as a treatment for bipolar disorder actually has effects on the circadian clock, which we thought was really, really interesting. And we wanted to see if there was something that we could understand about lithium by looking at circadian rhythms. It's been known that lithium response in the clinic is quite variable. Only about a third of patients turn out to be what you would call excellent responders to lithium. About a third are poor responders, and about another third are in between, where maybe they get somewhat better but need a second medication to get the rest of the way back to health. And we wanted to know, is there anything about the circadian rhythm that could tell us who was going to be a good predictor to lithium or who was going to be a poor predictor to lithium? So in collaboration with a colleague of mine, John Kelso, we participated in the pharmacogenetics of bipolar disorder trial. This was a big 2-year clinical trial where we recruited patients who were willing to take lithium, lithium monotherapy, so just lithium and nothing else. And we followed them over the course of 2 years to see who was going to turn out to be a responder and who was going to be a non-responder. And in this group of patients, we were able to get skin biopsies from about 60 patients. About 44 of them turned out to be responders, and about 15 of them turned out to be non-responders. And that math doesn't quite add up there. I'm not sure what happened there. We must have dropped one along the way there, but you get the idea. So we have some representation of responders and non-responders. And then we did the same experiment using our reporter gene in the skin cells from these patients. And before I tell you about that, we also asked them whether they were morning people or evening people. So it turns out that the responders, the ones who did well on lithium, turned out to be a little bit better at higher in morningness, which is kind of similar to what we found previously with the genetic studies. And the non-responders were more evening people. Turns out that the non-responders with low morningness also had more depressive symptoms at the beginning, more manic symptoms at the beginning, and seemed to be more likely to have had a previous suicide attempt. When we did the experiment in the skin cells, we found that the responders were more likely to have a short circadian period. And this is kind of interesting because we know that lithium tends to lengthen the period. So it seems that if you're kind of short to begin with, and lithium lengthens it, that seems to correct you. Whereas if you're already kind of long and lithium makes you longer, then that seems to put you over into a situation where your rhythm is not optimal and you become a non-responder. And so the proportion of people who had a short period in the response group was much higher than it was in the long group. And this is sort of a representative trace of what we saw in our experimental data when we looked at the rhythms from skin cells. So the non-responder rhythm is here in the red, and you can see that it's taking a little bit longer on every cycle to get through its course, whereas the blue with the responder is finishing its cycle on something a little bit closer to 24 hours. So the last few slides that I showed you were all done in skin cells. And of course, studying skin cells for a psychiatric disorder is not optimal, because what we're really concerned about is what's happening in the brain and how are the neurons of these patients different from their healthy colleagues and healthy friends and family. And so we've been able to use a method where we actually take the skin cells and reprogram them. We use some fancy molecular biology to turn the skin cells back into stem cells, and then using a host of different chemical factors, we can redevelop those stem cells into neurons and then grow neurons from a living patient in the dish. And so we used a subset of the cells that I showed you from our PGBD patients, so we know whether they're lithium responders or non-responders, and we actually made neurons out of some of these patients' cells as well. And we did the same experiment. We've done circadian rhythms now in these neurons, and what you can see is that the effects are a lot more striking in the neurons than they were in the fibroblasts. So in our control neurons, we got really nice circadian rhythms similar to what we saw before. But especially in the lithium non-responder patients, the rhythms are much, much weaker and much, much lower. And that really comes through in this amplitude here, where the red corresponds to the lithium non-responder, and the amplitude or the strength of the rhythm is really dropping off profoundly. We saw the same thing with the period being shorter in the responders versus the non-responders. So that was reassuring that our skin cells were capturing something interesting. And because this rhythm is so much weaker, that means that the rhythm damps out much faster. So you can see over the course of the day, or over the course of 5 days here, this rhythm is getting gradually weaker in the controls. It gets weak almost right away in the lithium non-responders. So it's already damped on day 1.5, whereas it takes about 3.5 days for the control rhythm to really damp down. We next did an experiment in these neurons where we put the neurons under a microscope and looked at them carefully so that we could see rhythms in individual cells. And this is what those results look like. So you can see here an individual cell. This is a control cell that's glowing on at about 12 hours and then gradually dimming down, and a bipolar cell doing the same kind of thing. And this really gives us resolution that we just didn't have looking at big plates full of cells. And so what we can find out is how many of the neurons are actually rhythmic and how many of the neurons are not rhythmic. And we found some really interesting results here. So first off, in these neural progenitor cells, which you could think of as developing neurons or neurons that aren't fully mature, it looks like the amount of rhythmic cells is very similar between the controls and the bipolars, not a big difference. But as the neurons develop, they become more rhythmic in the controls, to where about 1/3 of them are rhythmic, whereas in the bipolar patient neurons, only about a 1/5 of the neurons are rhythmic. So they're not developing to the same extent that the control neurons are, and they're not picking up the rhythms in the same way that the control neurons are. And so this difference in the neurons turned out to be really statistically significant. Then the other thing we wanted to see are the neurons in phase with each other? So is the rhythm in this group of cells kind of all rhythmic at the same time, or are they kind of doing their own sort of thing? So I like to think of this as maybe the stadium analogy, where in the stadium, you have people doing the wave. That's an example of a rhythm where it's all in phase. Everybody is putting up their arms at the same time because the rhythm is organized. Whereas after the wave stops and people start clapping and yelling on their own schedule, then it becomes desynchronized. And what we saw in the neurons is that these the neurons were roughly in phase with each other. You can see that this arrow is averaging out to somewhere around this point on the graph, which is representing here, that you can see this neuron and this neuron are both peaking at about the same time of the day. Whereas in the lithium non-responders and the lithium responders, you can see that these green dots are scattered more randomly across the 24-hour cycle, and they're not necessarily in phase with each other anymore. You can see, for example, this one is peaking here, and this one is peaking 12 hours earlier, or much earlier in the cycle. And so the phase alignment in bipolar disorder seems to be really profoundly affected at the neuron level in single cells. And so let me just summarize what we've talked about so far with cells. So on average, the bipolar disorder cells seem to have a longer period, which you can think of as the clock ticking a little more slowly. We found that this longer period in cells may actually predict lithium responsiveness in bipolar patients. And so that gives us a clue of how we might be able to develop a test to identify lithium responders more quickly. In neurons from bipolar subjects, it seems like the rhythms have a low amplitude and are more likely to be arrhythmic, and that they are more likely to show phase dispersal, so a less organized rhythm in the clock. And so with that, I'm going to transition now and talk just about kind of how we might be able to just guard our rhythms as people or as patients, and some of the advice that I give to my patients around circadian rhythms in my bipolar clinic. So first of all, let's talk about some of the places where rhythms may be at risk in bipolar disorder. So shift work is a really obvious one. When you're up all night working and then sleeping during the day, especially on people who have different shifts at different times of the week with an erratic schedule. So you might work nights on one time and then days on another and then second shift on another. That can wreak havoc with people's circadian rhythms, and it can often be destabilizing for people. So it's really important to see if you can work with your supervisor to provide some attention to your scheduling, make sure that there's ample time for recovery, and take extra caution around shift work. Drugs and alcohol are another important area. A lot of people with sleep problems will actually turn to something like alcohol to help promote sleep, but it turns out that alcohol is actually sleep disrupting and may cause worse sleep, which may lead to naps during the day and less activity during the day. Other things like stimulants, like caffeine or tobacco, may sometimes cause sleep disruption if they're taken too late in the day and can have the same kinds of effects. Sometimes patients with bipolar disorder need to be very careful about long distance travel. So jet lag can be a provoking trigger for manic episodes or depressive episodes. And it's not entirely clear, but there may even be some reliable information about which direction that you're traveling tends to cause which kind of problem. So for example, when you're traveling east and you're phase advancing, sometimes that's thought to trigger manic episodes, whereas traveling west and phase delaying may provoke depressive episodes. And then seasonal changes. So these times in the transitional seasons in spring and summer, where the days, or sorry, spring and fall, where the day length changes very, very rapidly, can sometimes be destabilizing. And we often talk about spring fever or spring mania. And then we talk about the fall can sometimes be a time when people's depression gets worse. And there are higher rates of mood episodes around spring and fall because of that reason. So what can we do about these things? So there are some simple steps that we can take that may promote healthy circadian rhythm. So early morning bright sunlight is definitely a good thing for most people to do. Avoiding bright light at night is also another way to stabilize your clock. Regular daytime exercise and activity. These exercise and activity kind of boost the effects of sunlight. So if you could do them together, they tend to be better than either one by themselves. And then regular meals, and really avoid eating at night. Food is another important signal to your circadian rhythm. And so food during the day is good, and snacks and eating at night can sometimes be very unhealthy and actually predispose people to obesity and other metabolic problems. A regular sleep schedule is very important. We recommend 7 to 9 hours of sleep every night. And that sleep and wake time should be really, really stable over the course of your week, even on weekends. So you really don't want to vary your sleep and wake time more than about an hour from a weekend to a weekday. If you can manage it, avoiding naps during the day will help consolidate your sleep and keep your sleep good at night. Really manage your stress. I think the exercise and things like that can help with that. And then social contact. It actually turns out that socialization is another trigger that helps link your circadian rhythms and boost your circadian rhythm. And of course, in these days, COVID-19 has thrown a monkey wrench in all of these things. And so it's really important to track these things and pay attention to these things, maybe more so than we ever were before. Which brings me to this last section of the slide, which is things like activity monitors and sleep monitors, or maybe apps on your phone, can sometimes be very, very helpful for these. There's a lot of dispute among scientists about how accurate these things are or how reliable they may be. But I find that for people who use them every day, it's a really good way of seeing if there's big shifts in your pattern. So it's your device, whatever accuracy it has, is probably well calibrated for you. And so if you're seeing that you've gone from an average of 7 hours of night of sleep down to 4 hours a night of sleep, something is wrong there. And it can sometimes give you some early feedback that you need to make an adjustment to your schedule. And then finally, for those of you who do come into clinical contact, there's actually psychotherapies that are based around circadian rhythms. The most famous one is called interpersonal and social rhythms therapy. And this is the idea that if our circadian clocks in bipolar disorder are somehow not working right, that we can use social support and scheduling to reinforce those biological functions that may not be fully functioning, and use things like when we go to exercise and when we go to work and when we eat our meals to rebuild some structure around the circadian clock and help people's moods. And this has been found to be helpful for people who have had mood relapses to have another relapse. It reduces the frequency of relapse if they participate in this kind of therapy. And so I think with that, I'll wrap up with just some quick summary. So I hope I've convinced you by now that circadian rhythms are a really critical aspect of life, not just for plants and bugs, but for humans as well. Rhythms are genetically influenced, but subject to your light and activity, and you can modulate these things through the choices that you make during the day. Circadian rhythm disturbances have really big effects on sleep and mood and activity. And these disturbances may be one of the factors that predispose people to bipolar disorder and could perhaps influence treatment for drugs like lithium. And then some treatments for bipolar disorder, including maybe lithium or maybe psychotherapies like interpersonal therapies, may actually work by boosting the circadian clock or bolstering rhythms. And so with that, I would just like to thank the people in my lab who have done a lot of the work that I showed you. The people in the other labs who I've worked with, John Kelso, David Welsh, and Fred Cage at the Salk Institute. And then the people who have funded my work, so including the International Bipolar Foundation, who supported me with a Young Investigators grant a few years ago, which is very generous and very helpful for this work that I've been able to do. And so I think I finished in time that we have some opportunity for questions. So why don't I turn it back over to Erin, who can maybe help us with the questions.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for this wonderful webinar. I know that this has been incredibly valuable information and really interesting research for our community. So yeah, we'll open it up for questions now. We've got a few minutes. So again, you can ask in either Zoom in the chat box or the question and answer portion of Zoom, or if you're participating on Facebook, again, you can just leave a comment. So we do have a few questions to begin with. The first question, this is someone who is wondering, if you know, how does menopause impact circadian rhythms as well as, with bipolar disorder?
That's a great question. So menopause is, for those who don't know sort of how it works, this is something that happens to older ladies as their levels of estrogen deteriorate, and it can cause things like hot and cold intolerance. It can cause changes in muscle mass, and it can cause hot flashes and mood changes. And so, I don't know if there's a really good answer for that. I can say that with the disruptions to sleep, for sure, it could certainly cause problems with daytime function and disrupted rhythms by disrupting sleep. I don't know for sure if estrogen has a role in the circadian timing system itself, but I wouldn't be surprised if it did. So I would guess that the estrogen hormone levels going down would have some impact on the rhythms that might make them weaker, and that the disruptions to sleep might have some impact on the activities on the next day.
Thank you for answering that. So the next question we have is from an individual who's joining us right now live, and they were wondering, does the extended circadian clock roll over? Meaning, does the 45 minutes make it harder with each successive day of being off, or will it eventually reset?
So this is where sunlight is really, really important. I showed you the experiments from the people who were living in the cave or who were living in isolation. And for those people, because they're not getting any sunlight, there is rollover. Every day got a little bit later, and every day people shifted a little bit farther out of alignment. And that's why they had these 27-hour cycles or 28-hour cycles. And you sometimes see this with blind people as well, too, where their rhythms tend to shift because they're not getting the sunlight that they need to resync their clock. So the good news is that because that sunlight hitting your SCN resets your clock every single morning, if you're good about getting bright light in the morning, that extra 45 minutes may not necessarily be all that important if you can be good about keeping on your schedule and keeping your clock locked into the light-dark cycle.
Wonderful. And then the next question we have, this individual, one of her twin boys was diagnosed when he was 7. Is there any research specifically for, young children with cyclothymia or bipolar disorder, specifically for individuals who, are younger and depend a lot more on a lot more hours of sleep?
That's a really interesting question too. And I know that there's a group in Australia who are looking at youths who are at risk for developing psychiatric disorders later in life. And some of them include people who already have diagnoses, or some of them are people who are, for various reasons, at risk. And one of the things that they really emphasize is making sure people get adequate sleep, especially young children and teenagers. And so I talked about how the circadian clock is maybe an extension of the stress system or the stress response. You can think of sleep deprivation as a stressor. And so by eliminating stress on people in general, I think these are protective things that we can do to help guard people who might be at particular risk for for diagnosing a bipolar disorder later in life. So things like good bedtime routines, regular schedules. Really, with young children, screen time is a big issue. A lot of children are on video games a lot. I know mine are, and they, that light at night can sometimes be destabilizing for their circadian clock. So managing screen time might be important. Getting them in a good habit for reducing activity at night. All of these kinds of things may help. And sometimes melatonin or a sleep aid can sometimes help with young children as well too, but that should be done in consultation with a doctor.
Yeah, I definitely know that I can sometimes be on my screen a little bit too long or a little
I
too
think we
late.
all can, yeah.
Yeah, that blue light can really affect your sleep patterns afterwards. So the next question I'll move on to, this is from an individual who is also a clinician, and they were wondering, as clinicians, should we, evaluate to morningness / even eveningness, those different, biological kind of sleep dispositions to help predict responsiveness to lithium? Should that be something that they're incorporating into their thoughts and evaluations when moving forward with medication prescription?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I think the idea of looking at morningness and eveningness in terms of lithium response is still early on. I don't think I'm ready to sort of endorse that as a something that every clinician should be doing to make a determination of lithium responsiveness. But I do think that it's worth asking about. As physicians, we often ask about how much sleep do you get? Are you getting your 8 hours of sleep? But we rarely ask, are you a morning person or are you an evening person? And that morning person and evening person question has a really profound impact on people's lives, like whether they're able to do well in school or whether they're able to function socially at home. And I think understanding something about this chronotype can really flesh out some of the person's sleep history and give people a better idea of what kind of situations may be more or less stressful for them, and what kind of opportunities might be helpful. Like you don't want to tell somebody to do early morning exercise if they're unable to wake up before 11 o'clock in the morning. You have to sort of tailor your treatments around people and consider these factors as well.
That's really great suggestion. Each individual, of course, has a different, individual experience, and their medication and treatment plan should be tailored specifically to them.
I think a lot of the data we see that links kind of evening types to bad outcomes is probably due to mismatches. So I think people who can somehow work with their schedule to be better suited to their chronotype may actually find that it's not that dangerous or not as bad as we might think just based on the data. I think it's not a coincidence that a lot of creative people work in things like the theater or music often happens at night. It doesn't happen usually at 8 o'clock in the morning. So I think there's some kind of recognition, maybe on a societal level, that creativity gravitates towards the evening.
Yeah, definitely. So the next question, you mentioned using activity trackers. Are there any that you specifically would recommend or know are really, really valuable tool?
You know, I don't know enough of the technical details and the differences between them to sort of sponsor, you know, advocate for one over the other. I know that, you know, I think the Fitbit is pretty good. I think that the iPhone is pretty good. I think that the Garmin is pretty good. But I don't want to sort of sound like I'm promoting any one over the others. I think any of the commercial fitness trackers tend to be pretty good by the time they've hit the market.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. And I think that that is all of the questions that we have time for right now. I just want to say thank you again so much for taking the time out of your day to present your research and offer these really valuable pieces of advice and suggestions for our community. I know that having this available on our website is going to be a great resource for anyone who needs, you know, a little bit of reassurance or help in figuring out their circadian rhythms and their biological clock.
Okay, well, it's really been a pleasure. Thank you so much for to everybody who was able to attend and for inviting me. I really had a good time. Thank you.
Of course, and if there are any additional follow-up questions, please feel free to email me at info@ibpf.org. This webinar will be available on our website and our YouTube channel, so if you need to look back at it, it will be there later today. So I invite you all to visit www.ibpf.org to learn more about some of our upcoming webinars and stay connected via our monthly e-newsletter, where we will also have this recording available. So we thank you all for joining us, and we wish you a wonderful week.
Thank you.
Bye, you guys.
Bye-bye.